Hi guys, and welcome to another video in the Unraid 6.9 series. In this video we're going to carry on setting up our Unraid server, and we're going to be looking at a new feature where we can set up multiple pools. So not only are we going to be looking at how to set them up, but also why and what we can do with them. So we're going to be looking at multiple pools, how to use them correctly with our shares, and how to make sure our shares are set up correctly. So if that sounds interesting, then let's get started. Okay, so this is a new install of Unraid, running Unraid 6.9.2, and the hardware in this server is it's an AMD server with an ASRock X470 Taichi Ultimate motherboard, a Ryzen 9 5950X CPU, and 64 gigs of DDR4 RAM. And the array here is made up of 8 8TB disks, one of which is parity, so giving a total here of 24 TB in the array. Now it has one pool device here, the cache drive, which is a regular SSD which is 1 TB in size. As well, there are 4 unassigned disks in this server as well, 2 of which are NVMe drives which are 2 TB each, and another 2 regular hard drives which are 1 TB each. Now if we click onto shares here, these are all the default shares which Unraid sets up. There's app data, which holds our data for our containers. There's domains, which holds our data for our VMs, and the ISO share is the share where we put our install media to install those VMs. And the system share, well, just like the name says, stores our system files. And if we look at the users tab, there's just one user at the moment, the root user. We'll be setting up other users here, which we'll use for the security with the shares. Obviously there's no containers installed on the Docker tab, and also there's no VMs installed on this server either. So before we actually go ahead and install any Docker containers or VMs, we want to plan exactly what we're going to do on the server, and so how we're going to set up the shares, and just what we're going to do with the unassigned disks at the bottom here. Well, until Unraid 6.9 was released, all we could do was use them as unassigned disks. But now since Unraid 6.9, we can use these additional disks and make multiple different cache pools. And yes, having multiple cache pools, that will increase the performance of the server. But in fact, you don't actually have to have a cache drive. You can run an Unraid server just on an array, but it's highly recommended to have at least one cache pool to improve the performance of both your Docker containers, VMs, and the write speeds to your server. But before we go and set up some new pools, I think it's important that we have another look at the shares tab here and see how all these shares work, so we can plan the best way to use our multiple pools. And so what we want to look at for the default shares here is this part here where it says cache. We can see here it says prefer cache for these 3 shares here, and this share here says yes cache. So basically where it says prefer cache here, when you set a share for the setting prefer, what Unraid will do is try and keep all of the data in that particular share, preferring to keep it on the pool device called cache. Now the only time it won't do that is if this pool becomes full. Should the pool become full, it will then put new files onto the array. But then if space becomes available on this pool later on, when mover runs, it will move the stuff that it put temporarily onto the array back onto the cache drive. So that's why on this share we see prefer and cache. So that's why we see app data preferring to use a pool device, because this stores all of the persistent data for our Docker containers. So it's best to have that on an SSD, which normally our pool devices are. And the same here for domains. This stores our VM disks, so you want them to be very fast as well, preferably running off an SSD. So this is set to prefer cache as well. And also this system share, this keeps our Docker image inside, where all of the actual containers for the Docker containers are written. So you may be wondering what's the difference between the data that's written here in the Docker image and what's written in the app data. Well, the data in the Docker image can change. Like when you update the container to a newer version, the Docker image is updated, but the app data isn't updated when you update the Docker container, because the app data contains all of the persistent data which needs to stay the same. Things like the configuration for that particular container. Think of it a bit like when you have a video game on a PC or a console. The actual game itself is kind of like the Docker image. You can update the game if there's a new patch that comes out to update it, because those parts are the same for everyone. And so the app data is like things like the game saves, how far you've got in the game, maybe you've customized a character. So it's all of the data that has to stay the same but is personal only to you. So the Docker image contains all of the universal container images, and the app data, all of the settings for that container that are personal to you. And there's something else in the system file as well. There's something called the libvirt image, which is used to store various things in to do with the VMs. Okay, so we can see why shares that are set to prefer want to have very fast I/O. But what's this other setting here where it says yes and then the name of the pool here, cache? What does yes mean and how is that different to prefer? So when a share is set to yes, what it means is that it will use a cache pool for all new files and directories that are written. So that will make the writes very fast. And the reason it says yes cache is because that's the name of the cache pool that it's going to use to do this. And so how this setting is different from prefer is because this time when mover runs, mover will move all of the files that have been written to that particular share over onto the parity protected array. So yes, it's similar to the other setting where it writes the new files to the pool, but it's different what it does with them when mover runs. If the share is set to yes, when mover runs it will move it to the array. If the share is set to prefer, mover does the opposite. It moves files from the array onto the cache. And we've also got this setting here only, where it will only use the cache for new files. Even if the cache becomes full, it will still keep on trying to write it there. So really, I'd never use that myself, and I think this will probably be moved from Unraid in future builds, as this prefer does the same but it's much better. Now the other setting obviously is this one no, where it doesn't use any of the pools for new files, it will just write directly to the array. Okay, so these share settings obviously have a lot to do with the pools. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up some more pools for some of these shares. So obviously the app data and the Docker image in the system file, well, that's to do with Docker. And the domains and the libvirt file in the system file is to do with VMs. So I'm going to set up two separate pools, one that I use for VMs and one that I use for Docker. So to do that we need to go to the main tab here and actually stop the array. So with the array stop, we're able to make changes to the pools. Now before I go and add a new one, I'm going to rename this one here. So to do that, I'm just going to click onto its name here, but I just want to draw your attention to one thing first. If you look at the name of this pool, it's cache and it starts with a capital letter. But if you look here, everything's lowercase. It only gets capitalized by the web GUI display on the main tab. Anyway, so if we click on the pool's name here, we can change it if we want to. And I'm going to change this pool's name to reflect the type of drive that this pool is on. So I'm going to rename this pool to cache_SSD and then click onto the rename button to confirm the change and then click done. Okay, so back on the main tab, if we scroll back down, we can see the name of the cache pool. Its name has changed correctly, but being displayed in the GUI is being displayed with a capital C. So let's add another cache pool now. So I'm going to click onto add pool here. And this pool I'm going to call cache_NVME. And next we choose how many drives we want to make up this cache pool. And we do that by assigning the number of slots. I only want this pool to be one drive, so I'll just assign one slot. So once the pool's been named and we've defined the number of slots, we just need to click the add button here. Okay, so now let's scroll down to see that pool. We can see it here, cache NVME. So now we can choose the disk that's going to be part of this pool. At the moment it says unassigned, but clicking onto that, I can choose a drive from the available drives left on the server. So obviously if I name this pool cache NVMe, I'm going to choose an NVMe drive. So I'm going to choose between these two here. I think I'm going to choose the Western Digital. Now because this pool only consists of one drive, I can actually choose the file system that this pool will use. By default, obviously, it's set to auto, and so the default file system for pool devices is ButterFS. So if I were to leave this on auto, that's the file system that this pool would be formatted in. And the reason that ButterFS is the default file system for pool devices on Unraid, because it's the only file system here that allows us to use multiple drives in different BTRFS profiles such as RAID 1, RAID 0, RAID 5, etc. But because I'm only using one drive in this pool, I'm going to choose XFS for this pool's file system. Okay, to confirm that change, I'm going to click onto apply and then done. And now I'm going to add another cache pool, so I'm going to click add pool again. Again, this pool I only want it to have one drive, so I'm just going to choose one slot, and I'm going to name this pool VMs_NVMe. And for this pool, again, I want it to have an NVMe drive, so I'll choose this Sabrent one here. And again, I think I'm going to choose XFS for this drive as well. Okay, so lastly, I'm going to add one extra pool in which I'm going to add 2 drives to this particular pool. And because I'm adding 2 drives, the default file system will be ButterFS this time, and the pool by default will be created in RAID 1. So that will give me redundancy should a drive fail. So because this pool's got redundancy, let's call it cache_protected. And I'm going to set the slots to 2 this time, and then assign the first disk to slot 1 and the second disk to slot 2. Okay, so that's both of those disks added to this pool. And these 2 disks in fact aren't actually SSDs, these are just normal mechanical disks. You can assign mechanical disks, SSDs or NVMEs to a pool, but unfortunately when making this tutorial I didn't have any extra SSDs to actually demonstrate, so I'm using normal mechanical. Okay, so now if we click on this 2 disk pool here, like I mentioned earlier, when there's multiple disks the only file system we can use is ButterFS or ButterFS encrypted. So I'm going to leave it on auto, which is ButterFS but the non-encrypted version. Okay, so those are all the pools assigned that I want to set up. So now I can scroll down to the bottom and start up the array. And when the array starts, we're going to get prompted to format the disks. It will say that they're unmountable. So all we need to do is scroll down and check this tick box here to allow formatting. And of course with the format anything on the disks will be erased. So with the warning out the way, let's click onto format and then wait for Unraid to format all of the drives in the new pools. Okay, so now all of the pool devices, they've been formatted, and now this server has 4 different pools. So obviously the fastest pools are the ones that are on NVMe drives. This cache NVMe here, now this I'm going to use to put my Docker images on and my app data on. The other NVMe pool here is the VMs one. So obviously this, storing all of the VDIS for the various VMs I'm going to set up. And this pool here, the cache SSD, obviously this is the original cache drive that I had in the server. This pool won't have any Docker images, any app data or any VMs on it. I really want to keep the I/O separate for all of those different things. So what this pool will be used for is for accelerating writes to various shares in the array. And I'm going to have a separate download share which uses this drive, so all of the downloads will go straight to that drive, that SSD, which will have a number of different advantages. And the most obvious one being is it's not going to be writing directly to the array, so it's going to save wear and tear on my main drives. As well, if you're someone that does a lot of downloading, you don't really want lots of I/O writes going to your main array, and you certainly don't want it going to where your Docker containers, your app data or your VMs are running. So keeping it separate will really help the performance of the server. And another reason for keeping where we download stuff separate is because people who download a whole bunch of stuff all the time, sometimes it can actually fill up the cache drive before Mover has a chance to move it when it runs. So you might be thinking, well, what's so bad about that? Well, nothing, unless it's the same location where you also store your VDisks for your VMs, your app data for your Docker containers or the Docker image. Because the Docker and the VM service don't like it if they run out of space where they keep their files. It can cause them to crash. So keeping things separate stops us having to worry about that happening. So now let's look at this last cache pool I've got here, the one with the 2 disks, where I'm protected should one of those disks fail. Well, this pool is also going to be used to accelerate writes to shares, but only very specific shares. So any share where it would be really bad if you were to lose that data before it was written to the parity protected array when Mover ran. And a prime example of that is a Nextcloud share. And for you new users who don't actually know what Nextcloud is, well, it's a self-hosted cloud service, kind of a bit like Google Drive, Dropbox, that kind of thing. So when we're running Nextcloud, it's really important that we get good fast writes, but at the same time we don't want to risk losing any data should anything bad happen before Mover runs. So a RAID 1 ButterFS pool is perfect for that. Now obviously it'd be much better if these were SSDs, so for the sake of this video just imagine they are. Now I'm sure many of you are thinking, well, isn't it better to have all of the pool devices set up this way with 2 disks or more? That way the VM pool would be protected, and the pool where I store the app data, that would be protected too. And maybe in an ideal world that would be the best way to set it up. But sadly we don't live in a perfect world, and we have to make the best of what we got. my motherboard only has 2 slots for NVMe drives, and I've got 2 2TB NVMEs. So I can choose to have 2 2TB NVMe pools or 1 2TB NVMe pool that's protected. So for me personally, I'd rather have the 2 separate pools than have a total of 4 TB usable space. And anyway, we can have the app data automatically back up using an excellent plugin called CA Backup Restore App Data. And similarly, we can actually back up the VM vDisks as well with another plugin. So for me personally, I don't mind if one of the drives fails and I lose some data, because I can always restore to a recent backup. Right, so let's move on. So we've got the 4 cache pools all set up. So now we need to make some changes in the server to be able to use them how we want. So let's go back over to the shares tab here, because the cache pools these shares are using, they're not correct. And as well, even the cache pool that's mentioned here, I've even renamed that to cache SSD anyway, so all of it needs changing. Okay, so the app data, let's click onto this here. I'm going to leave this on prefer, and the cache pool, I want it to go to cache NVMe. All of my app data I want on there. So I'm going to click on to apply, and done. Okay, so now that's on cache NVMe. Now for domains, where the vDisks are stored, I want to change this too. So I'm going to click onto this here, and choose VM's NVMe here, and click on to apply, and done. Okay, so that's 2 of the shares done. So for ISOs, I'm going to make this be cache accelerated. But for this one, I just want to use the regular SSD cache just to accelerate writes to this share. And I'm going to click on to apply, and done. And now finally the system share, which has the Docker image and the libvirt image in, I'm going to put this on the NVMe cache where I keep my app data. Okay, so now I'm going to click on to apply and then done. And now there's one thing we need to do just to get everything perfectly correct. If I go onto the main tab here, and I look on the old cache here, you can see here I've got an app data folder, a domains folder, and a system folder here. And these folders were all set up by Unraid when the server was first created. So now I've made new cache pools and changed where I want data to go, these aren't relevant anymore. But luckily, because the server's only just been set up, there's nothing in them, so I can just go ahead and delete them all. So to be able to do that, I just need to make sure the Docker service and the VM service are not running. So I want to go across to settings here, and go to Docker. I'm going to turn the Docker service off. And also I'm going to do the same under the VM manager. I'm going to turn the VM service off as well. Now the reason I'm doing this is because I want to delete the folders here, and if I hadn't have stopped those services, then files in the system share would have been in use. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this location I can see here, which is the location of my original cache drive, and I'm going to open a terminal window, and I'm going to type rm -r. Now this command will delete everything, all of the folders recursively, in the location that I specify. And so now I'm going to paste the location of where those files are, and then put / and then an asterisk. So that will delete all of the folders here. Okay, so that's done. So if I refresh the page now, we can see there's nothing here. Okay, so now it's time to go back to settings again, and I'm going to go to Docker settings here, and you can see here now it says that one or more paths don't exist. Now don't worry about this, we can leave it as it is. Now because we're setting up the Docker service again here, we can see a new feature of Unraid 6.9. We've now got the option to set up where our Docker containers are stored. We can use a ButterFS vdisk, an XFS vdisk, or a directory. So you may be wondering what one to actually choose. And what you choose here has no bearing on how you formatted the cache pool. If your cache pool is ButterFS, doesn't mean you need to choose a ButterFS vdisk for your Docker image. And the same goes to XFS. You don't need to choose XFS just because your cache drive is formatted as XFS. So the main choice here is whether to use a vdisk or use a directory to store your Docker containers. And I guess there's advantages and disadvantages to each. Using a vdisk, you choose the size for that vdisk, and the more containers you install, the more this gets filled up. So having a limit on its size can be considered an advantage, because if you happen to misconfigure a container and accidentally have it writing data within the actual Docker image itself, then you'll probably find this out pretty quickly when Unraid warns that the Docker image is becoming full, and so because of that warning you can then find out why that's happening and take the appropriate action. And so while this is an advantage, you could also say it's a disadvantage as well, because if the Docker image becomes full, then the Docker service will actually stop working. But yes, you can always increase the size of the Docker image, that isn't a problem, but the advantages of using a directory is that it's not constrained by a certain size. For example, if you only have one Docker container on your system, then your Docker directory will only take up a small amount of space because that one container is there only. However, if you installed that same container on a vdisk as your Docker image, because it's installed inside an image, that image when it was first created will take up on the cache drive the full space of what its size is. So a 20 gig Docker image file will take up 20 gigs on your cache drive, no matter if it's full or empty of containers. Okay, so what should you choose? Well, basically if you're a beginner, I would say choose a ButterFS vdisk. We've used them on Unraid for years and they work well. But if you're an experienced Unraid user, then why not use a directory? Okay, so when you've chosen what you want to use, then start up the Docker service. Then we want to go to the VM manager and start up the VM service as well. Again, ignore where it says the paths don't exist, that's just because we deleted them a moment ago. So set enable VMs to yes, click apply and then done. And so now let's go back to the main tab here. Let's have a look at this pool here, the cache NVME. Okay, and here we can see we've now got the app data folder and the system folder. That's good, that's correct. Okay, so now let's see what we can see in the VM's NVMe pool. Okay, good, so as expected we've got the domain share. And so now if we look at the original cache drive, the cache SSD, there shouldn't be anything there at all. Okay, so that's good, so obviously everything's set up correctly now, all of the default shares are working correctly and they're using the correct cache pools. Okay, so now it's time to move on. So now we need to start thinking about what shares we should create for what we're going to be using on the server. But that's going to be in the next part of the Unraid 6.9 series. In that part we're not only going to set up various different shares, we're going to think about when we should have a share cache enabled and the times we shouldn't have a share cache enabled and why. We're going to see examples of different shares using different types of cache pools. We're going to be thinking about whether we should let shares use all of the disks in our array or maybe only just some of them. So basically we're going to be planning the shares on our server to be the best they can be. But like I said, that's the next video. So if you enjoyed this video, then please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, and share the video with anyone who you think might find it useful. To all of my patrons and supporters who might be watching this video, thank you so much guys for your support, I really do appreciate it. Anyways, it's the end of this video, it's time for me to go, but whatever you're up to for the rest of the day, I hope it's good, and I'll catch you in the next video.